Okay, so this is part of your homework for this week is to listen to this lecture concerning the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes of the Supreme Court once said, "It is an experiment, as all life is an experiment. The Constitution was an experiment by the Founding Fathers to create a sustainable and lasting government of sorts, to make a country that would last. And the Constitution is our basis of our entire existence as the United States of America. If you took away the Constitution, a lot of our safeguards, a lot of the rights that we have guaranteed today would not be accessible." Section 1 is the 6 basic principles of the Constitution. Okay. So first we have a brief outline of the Constitution. We have the introduction, aka the preamble. I'll share a link with you guys to watch Schoolhouse Rock if you wanted to learn it that way, but you also have this on your major quiz. You'll see it again on your unit test and again on your final. Okay. The state's general purposes of the Constitution, that's the whole idea of the preamble. So we the people, ... The American public is the true ruler, also known as popular sovereignty. Equal worth of all people is essential to the Constitution. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg also stated that. So when we're looking at the Constitution in 2016, we're looking at the equality of every citizen in the United States. No one is more important than the other. Even if you don't think that that's the interpretation of the Constitution now, it is applying to every citizen. It's also divided into several sections known as articles, so we'll go over all of those individually, followed by 27 amendments. Okay. The basic principles. Number 1, popular sovereignty. People are the source of all governmental power, i.e. the basis of a democratic republic. The people are the source. Limited government, also known as constitutionalism. Government conducted according to a constitution or to the constitution in general, limiting the government of what it can and cannot do to its citizens and to even itself. Separation of powers. Division of powers in the national government. 3 branches established: the legislative, which makes the laws, the executive, which enforces the laws, and the judicial, which interprets the law. Checks and balances. Okay, to guarantee separation of powers, the founders built in overlapping powers. So the legislative can check the executive, the judicial can check the other two, etc. There's ambition countering ambition, and it's necessary. James Madison believed that wholeheartedly, and we'll get into that quote for this week's reading, which is in Federalist number 51. Each branch of government is able to participate in and influence the activities of other branches. I kind of said that already, but here's a perfect example so you can put it into your brains. Okay, presidential veto on congressional legislation. Okay, that's the power of the president to veto, or the Senate approval of presidential nominees. If the Senate says no, a particular person, like for example a Supreme Court justice, cannot be appointed to that particular position. So those are just one example of a checks and balance. There's plenty of more that, as we'll see throughout our course. Next we have judicial review. The power of the courts to determine whether what the government does, lines up with the Constitution. Is what the law that was passed, was what the executive action that President Obama wrote and signed, does that line up with what the Constitution says? Judicial review is derived by Federalist number 51 and 78, and you're reading number 51 this week for your homework, which is kind of cool. Weird, I would connect them. Okay, established by the Supreme Court in major case Marbury v. Madison, and we're going to get into that chunk of that case next week. So hold on to that thought for next week. And then finally, our 6th principle is federalism, a political system in which power is shared between the national and state governments. That's definition taken from Monk, page 118. It's the annotated version of the Constitution. And then, of course, division was between the national government and the states, and that's taken from another textbook, as you see there. Now we're going to get into our branches, which you are already familiar with, but we're going to go into again over and over and over again until you never forget them. So the branches, okay? The people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived. And that was said by James Madison, father and drafter of the Constitution. You can see on there in the clip art how the U.S. government is into three branches there. So our first article is the Congress. Article 1 is the Congress, and they have the power to make laws. They're separated into two houses, Senate and the House of Representatives. There's the seal for the Congress. The House of Representatives, there's 2-year terms, and the number of representatives is based on each state's population. Obviously, California has the most. We have the biggest population in the union. Reps must be at least 25 years old, so now Miss Patchen can run for House of Representative position. Before, I could not. You must be at least 25. A U.S. citizen, either born in the United States, born on a military base, and there's a couple other weird exceptions that we'll get into later, but for the most part, those are the two accepted forms of being a citizen, okay? Then, resident of the state they represent, so you have to live in the state you're running in. So, I live in California. I could not run for a position from Colorado because I live in California. Senate, 6-year terms. Each state sends 2 senators. Remember, that's from the New Jersey plan. All right. Reps must be at least 32 years old, which means Ms. Patchen cannot run. Unfortunately, I cannot be a senator. You have to be a U.S. citizen for at least 10 years, meaning you've gained your citizenship for a certain amount of time, or you have always lived here, etc. You have to be a citizen for at least 10 years. Weirdly, they don't necessarily require your senators to be living in the state you represent, but that's kind of like an unsaid thing. You need to live where you are representing. Otherwise, your constituency will get quite wise about where you're from and what you're doing. Next, we have the president, which is Article 2. The president serves 4-year terms with a maximum of a 2-term max, So you only can have 8 years in office. The only president to do it more was FDR, and after he passed, there was actually an amendment added. We'll get into that later when we actually talk about the presidency as its own chapter or its own unit. Chief executive. Okay, there's some of his or her responsibility. The president's duty to see that the laws of the land are carried out. Commander-in-Chief. He's the head of all U.S. military forces. Okay. Executive privilege. A doctrine that the president does not have to share certain information with Congress or the judiciary. And that comes from Federalist number 57. So it's saying, hey, the president can keep some secrets. Now, there are 2 cases that kind of challenge that idea. You have U.S. v. Nixon in 1974. The Supreme Court does have the final voice in determining constitutional questions. No person, not even the President of the United States, is completely above the law. And the President cannot use executive privilege as an excuse to withhold evidence that is demonstrably relevant in a criminal trial. So U.S. v. Nixon of 1974 directly challenges the idea of executive privilege. And many political scientists and even congressional members will cite this Supreme Court case as a challenge that the presidency cannot hold on to secrets forever. There are certain things the president cannot withhold, and that's something like crime. If you're aware of that a crime is being committed, you cannot hold out on information. Okay. And then, of course, Bush v. Gore of 2000, a legislature could take back the power to appoint electors at any time. Now, remember, Gore won the Electoral College initially, but Bush took the popular vote. That new ruling, Florida reallocated its electors to President Bush, putting him in the White House. That's another executive privilege thing that goes on there. Here is a nifty graph of the 7 roles of president. This will be on your Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 major quiz study guide. It'll be on your quiz. Here are the 7. You have the chief executive. He's the boss of the cabinet and other parts of the of the executive branch. Whew, Miss Patchen, you're slipping. Chief diplomat, decider of foreign policy and primary diplomat. He is our face to the world. Okay, commander-in-chief, supreme commander of the U.S. military. All the orders okay, come from the president. He's the final say on what we do on the battlefield. Chief legislature. He can try to influence Congress to pass certain bills or veto bills that he doesn't like. He has to push forward his policy and agenda through Congress, and he has to influence for his party and for his agenda. Chief of the party. He ensures that his party gains power by appointing them and getting them elected. He campaigns on behalf of his fellow party members. So, for example, President Obama is once in a while, not all the time, campaigning for Hillary Clinton or other different Democrats that are running for different seats. He's also the chief guardian of the economy. I don't know why guardian is spelled wrong, but you should know how to spell it. He protects the economy by reducing unemployment and working with economists. Now, some presidents work more closely than others with the Federal Reserve, etc., to bolster the economy. Sometimes different presidents have different goals of what they want to achieve. And finally, Chief of State. He's the personification of American ideals, inspires and rewards people. Now that role is usually up for debate. We won't debate here. You can leave a comment on the bottom at the video if you want to debate that with your classmates, or we can save it for our Schoology app that we're going to be using. A judicial branch, Article 3. Okay. Now, the Supreme Court is the only court mentioned in the Constitution. So they're it. Okay. So that's what a lot of people get wrong when they think of, oh, Article 3 sets up everything. No, it doesn't. Okay. But it does say they get lifetime terms. Okay. They're appointed by the president with approval of the Senate. If the Senate does not approve of the judicial member being appointed by the president has to choose a new one. They interpret the Constitution and applies it as it sees fit. There's Lady Justice being blind. We've talked about her a couple of times. Okay. So there are some important terms. The first one, when you talk about the judicial branch, philosophy under which judges avoid overturning statutes and precedents. So when judges are using restraint, they're looking at it as they're not going to go out of their way to overturn statutes and precedents. They're going to try to let be, or it's happened, let be, excuse me. Judicial activism is the opposite of that, okay? Their judges don't avoid overturning statutes and precedents, and in fact, some look to actively overturn older statutes, court rulings, etc. They look to be activists from the bench. Most conservative judges will look at judicial restraint or use that philosophy, while more liberal judges will use activism to promote their ideas. But both types of judges can use either one depending on what the issue is. Okay. Then you have strict construction. This is the policy of construing the Constitution's text narrowly to limit governmental power. So we're looking at this more of the Republican side, strict construction. And the opposite would be loose. Okay? The policy of construing the Constitution's text broadly to allow flexible governmental power. So when you look at loose constructionists, they're trying to give as much power to the government as possible, to give as much leeway as possible. And most time liberals like large government helping out. You know, they like the idea of being helped, and they see governmental power being created as a good thing. Okay, so usually we see these two constructions playing out. One party follows it or the other, but there are times they'll use either construction to their advantage. It just simply depends on the context. So we'll have to wait and see on a number of different things. Then we have jurisdiction, the legal authority of a court to hear and decide a case. There are some cases that can't be heard in certain courts simply because the court does not have jurisdiction in the case. And we'll get into specifics of that later on. More important terms. Advisory opinions. These are determinations by the Supreme Court whether future actions of the President or Congress would be constitutional. So they're giving advice about what actions would work. So sometimes presidents request opinions from the Supreme Court on potential executive orders before it's even written in and signed to see if it would hold up to be constitutional. It's actually a very smart thing to do. The writ of certiorari, okay? An order issued by the U.S. Supreme Court that directs a lower court to transmit records for a case that it will hear on appeal. So basically, it's basically a records request. That's the easiest way to describe that. Now, there are some current major court cases. They might have already been heard, but these are three that have really stuck out in my mind. So just bear with me on that. You have Town of Greece versus Galloway. The justices will decide whether a town's council practice of beginning its legislative meetings with a prayer session violates the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Then you have National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning. This high-profile case invites the court to interpret the breadth of the president's constitutional authority to make appointments during Senate recesses. So this court issue is the president waited for Congress to be on a break or on a recess where they couldn't hear appointments or make appointee votes, and so the person was automatically put into power. So we're going to see a power struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And finally, Hall v. Florida. The justices will determine how states define if a person is mentally disabled to the point of becoming ineligible for the death penalty. How far is too far for mental disablement to not be responsible or to be considered a cruel and unusual punishment to receive the death penalty, especially if these people didn't know what they were doing was wrong in the first place or had little to no conception of what their acts truly meant. That's another major issue. You can feel free to comment below on what you think about Hall v. Florida. If you think that you kill X amount of people or you murder in general, you get the death penalty, etc. Or are there limits on who cannot be put to death in the United States? Okay, so the current U.S. Supreme Court, these people, this guy right here, Antonio Scalia, actually passed away, so he is gone. We currently have 4 on 4, and we have yet to see who will take his place. So we have to wait to see. Now, formal amendments. This is how we can amend the Constitution. Now we're in Section 2 of our Chapter 3. Ways to change the Constitution. There are two major ways: formal amendment and informal amendment. And within those two ways to change, there are 4 methods. Okay, a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress and be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's 38 states for those who don't want to do math. Okay, 26 out of 27 amendments were adopted in this fashion. Okay. Amendment may be proposed by Congress, then ratified by state conventions in 3/4 of the states. Used to adopt Amendment 21. And then any amendment may be proposed by a national convention called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the states, which is 34 states. And then finally, amendment proposed by a national convention and ratified by conventions in 3/4 states. Obviously, 1 and 2 have only been used or been successful. 3 and 4 have yet to happen, but there's always possibilities for this to happen. The Constitution itself was adopted by number 4. So only number 3 has technically been not used or unsuccessful. Proposed amendments. Article 5. Okay. No state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Nearly 15,000 joint resolutions calling for amendments. Only 33 of them have ever been sent to the states, and only 27 have been ratified. Here's a Ronald Reagan quote for those of us who like Ronald Reagan. We must rely on the states to force Congress to act on our amendment. Our nation's founders gave us the means to amend the Constitution through action of state legislatures. That is the only strategy that will work. That's how Ronald Reagan saw a way of getting around this 15,000 resolutions only being sent, only 33 being sent out of 15,000. So he's like, guys, we have other means. We have number 3, if you remember back from the ways to change the methods. We can use number 3. We just haven't done it yet. Ronald Reagan was a big proponent of doing that. The Bill of Rights, which all of you should be familiar with. We'll watch a fun video on it, hopefully on Tuesday. The first 10 amendments set out the great constitutional guarantees of freedom. Okay. Set aside amendments, okay, had to be added as per the agreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. We talked about that whole entire agreement last week. The Bill of Rights is simply an add-on, the first 10, yeah? Now, constitutional change by other means, meaning we didn't use those two ways before. We didn't use those four methods within the two ways. So here we go, section 3. Words needed to be defined. An executive agreement. An agreement made between the president and another country that has the force of a treaty but does not require the Senate's advice and consent. A treaty. A formal agreement between nations and given Senate approval. Electoral college. A group of electors selected by voters in each state and the District of Columbia. The electors officially elect the president and vice president. Cabinet, the advisory body to the president. They are chosen by the president. They do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. And finally, senatorial courtesy, the custom of giving senators of the president's party a virtual veto over appointments to jobs, including judicial appointments in their states, meaning the president's party is in control on the appointments. Okay. So 5 basic ways. First, the passage of basic legislation by Congress. Actions taken by the president. Key decisions by the Supreme Court. The activities of political parties, and custom. Okay. Now, you can kind of get a preview for your homework or your stuff that we'll be doing next week, where you guys are going to get into groups. You're going to create a brief public service announcement describing the assigned method, which are the 5 we just talked about, and providing examples of change. Groups will present at the end of the block period, which will be not this week, but next week, and your grade will be based on personal participation in group work's accuracy and creativity, etc. But then again, we might run out of time, so we will see. But get your brains working on who you might want to work with and what your public service announcement will look like. It will not be videoed or PowerPoint. It will just be almost like a poster that you would see that would be for propaganda. And this concludes Chapter 3's lecture. I don't have any fun facts for you other than that today is 9/11. It's been 15 years since the attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Pennsylvania. And please remember that this is a serious date and should be revered. And with that, have a good night, guys.